Hello, everyone. Hope you're having a great day. Thanks for joining us. Really appreciate it. Today, like we have about once a month for our Misadventures podcast, we get into issues that we face in our society and how we can look to organizational alignment to be able to go and address them. And today, we're really looking deep into the concept of diversity, inclusion, and equity. And we have Beth Zemsky in as our guest. Beth is a marvelous social justice activist and consultant working with people on intercultural organizational development, tying processes and procedures of DE&I into the fabric of everything that's done, rather than it just being an initiative that sits separate from all the different daily goings on. Beth and I here have a great conversation that delves into a little bit on what the definitions are on diversity, inclusion, and equity, where organizations kind of lack or what they need to really start with first before they get into the work of DE&I. We get into the aspect of really building up that capacity, the muscles of being able to work in more of a diverse, inclusive, and equitable organization, and the huge business benefits that can happen, not only inside the company, but for all the stakeholders that you have when you're able to go and take on these diverse ideas and be able to go and lean in, even when uncomfortable, to the possibilities that are there and going and driving the positive in everything that can happen and being able to go and see the fruits of that labor. So without further ado, let's go and get into our conversation with Beth Zemsky. Beth Zemsky, thank you so much for being part of the Misadventures and Organizational Misalignment podcast. It's absolutely great to be able to go and have a chance to talk with you today.
Thanks, Eric. Happy to be here. I was pleased by the invitation and, really impressed by the work, you and Ecometrics are doing. So happy to be in this adventure or misadventure with you.
So yeah, we generally call it the Misadventures in Organizational Misalignment because there's so many organizations that have so many different things that are misconnected and are put in there that put gums in the work, and we go and talk about those things quite a bit. And one of those things obviously is this concept of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how those three ideas, concepts are many times seen separate, but are so interconnected with the fulfillment of an organization's mission and vision, that this is a topic that, along with kind of brought in with social justice, is something that we do on a monthly basis because it really is that important. So just to kind of give every one of the listeners a little bit of an idea of Beth's credentials and chops, she has been a social justice advocate, a adjunct faculty at the University of Minnesota, and for the last 14 years has been an intercultural organizational development consultant, working with a ton of different organizations, and I'll let you get into a little bit more, Beth, around this aspect of social justice, DE&I, all these types of things. So if you could maybe explain a little bit more about kind of what you do working with organizations, the type of organizations that you work with, that would be marvelous for the listeners.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Eric. So the work I do, I call intercultural organizational development. Now, there's some jargon for you. And we'll talk about intercultural in a moment, but let me just say why I do the work the way I do it. Often organizations have a mission, vision, or value about diversity, inclusion, and equity. And what happens organizationally is our diversity work or our inclusion work, even our equity work, is kind of like over there. So imagine sort of my hand going off to the left. And then we have our strategic plan, our organizational development, maybe even our organizational change management processes kind of over there. Imagine my hand going off to the right. So we sort of sometimes imagine, particularly in large organizations that are often silo around function, our diversity, inclusion, and equity work not connected to our core mission, vision, value, not connected to our strategic plan, not connected to our organizational development, not connected to our change management. And the work I do is with organizations like, if you want to reach your diversity, inclusion, and equity goals, all this stuff has to be integrated. It has to be connected to your core mission, vision, values. It has to be connected to your strategic plan, your basic change management, and your organizational development piece. Because where diversity, inclusion, equity live in an organization is in your organizational culture. And organizational culture, as you know, Eric, organizational culture actually lives in our policies, practices. It's just the way we do things around here. So if we really want to reach our diversity, inclusion, equity goals, we have to think of that as an organizational development activity that is tied to our basic strategic plan. There's my dog. So the key piece about my work is helping organizations really see, understand, and act on their commitment to DEI, which I really believe is the only way to do that is to connect it to the core mission, vision, strategy of the organization, because where organizational culture really lives is in our policies and practices. And so if we really want to live our values around DEI, we have to think about what are the assumptions we make as we develop our policies and practices. How much have we incorporated diversity, inclusion, equity into those? And how much are we willing to shift those? So that's why I think about this work as organizational development work.
Right, absolutely. I totally get it. Why do you think organizations in general, and you see it just as much as I do, they keep it separate, like it is this add-on or something to kind of keep separate from it? Do they think they believe that having that specific focus that's, or lack of focus, but it's called out there, actually allows them to put more focus into it? Or what's your feeling on why they kind of keep it separate?
So I think there's two things. I think that we have positioned, and I just want to be clear because your listeners might not know this because I think we're doing audio only for this, is, I'm white. And so I just say, I think that for people, particularly of my generation, I'm a boomer. I think we really grew up believing issues around racism was about our personal feelings, our biases. And if we were able to sort of think about being more open-hearted, open-minded, that was the key. So we saw this as sort of like, I just need to have more of an open heart, open mind. So we saw this sort of an individual kind of thing. And then in organizations, I think we thought, okay, so there's some human relations stuff we need to do so people could be more open-hearted. And then maybe there's some teaching and learning. So the idea that we could just train folks about how to interact. So that the focus was very much on hearts and minds and potentially interpersonal behavior, which I think is fine. And it's not, so all of those things are important, but they don't get to the institutional and systemic and structural way that inequities are operating in our organizations. So I think that because we position diversity work and inclusion word as really an intra or interpersonal piece, not a systemic piece, we've developed approaches in the field that focused on that.
It also seems like it's kind of considered this initiative or program that it's been something that's been lacking. So let's address this and bring certain people on and have specific goals. But your aspect of saying that, and quite honestly, it's systemic in our culture regardless, to actually not have it systemically within the essence of your culture and your mission, by its very nature, will probably allow it to only go so far, huh?
Well, and we'll get into this a little later, I know, Eric. One of the things I know developmentally, and we'll talk about the developmental piece in a bit, is that there is a particular developmental way that 65% of everybody deals with intercultural challenges called minimization, in which we mean incredibly well. We're really good at finding commonalities with people different than ourselves, but we don't see about how, particularly for those of us who are dominant culture, our values, our belief systems, our behavioral expectations are built into everything we do, and the systems we create. We project that everybody's just like us. So we're overestimating commonality, often out of a good-hearted place of, I can see the core humanity in you and I don't want to treat you any different. So we're seeing commonality, but we're not really dealing with the depth of the difference of people's experiences and how systems work. What happens, and we can talk more about this, but what happens organizationally is that we have super good intent, but not necessarily the skills and the systemic ability to achieve our impact. In short, what we often want is change without changing anything about ourselves. So we want to know more, we want to have more open hearts, but we really don't want to change what happens in my life, or how comfortable I am going to work, or the way I might need to operate. And the thing is, with almost anything else, if you want change, we have to change.
And that's really interesting. That gets into something we do a lot of work with education organizations, K-12, and there's a concept called Marzano's orders of change. And I don't know if you're familiar with it, but there are 3 orders of change that have been studied, and a lot of superintendents talk about. The current superintendent at St. Paul, Joe Gothard, is the one that brought it up to me initially. Is that first order of change, when, say, a new leader comes in and they want to make some changes, they'll go, oh, I kind of like this guy. I'll take this stuff in and accept it and try and mold it. But that second order of change, it's like, holy cow, you're actually asking me to really change in some fundamental ways. Yeah, this personal relationship may not actually go and give me enough reason to go and do it. And then the third is the real transformational types of change that are there. So it's really kind of interesting you have that. And I suppose that's why a lot of organizations think that training, to be able to go and help people with some tools and resources to say, how do I use this open heart that I have to actually start practicing some ways to maybe do more than find commonalities and actually embrace the differences, the uniqueness, the mutations and nuances for the betterment of me as well as the organization. Do you find it that way, or am I off base?
So I'm not sure I'm directly responding, but let me just clarify something. I think training is really important. I think what training can do, and maybe this is what you're getting at, Eric, I think training can give us some shared language to have conversations, to explore things. It can also give us some shared tools, right? Some shared skills. The challenge is when we think that's it. So when I was at the University of Minnesota, I cannot quote the reference right now, I'm sorry to say, but a colleague of mine shared a piece of research with me that really impacted me. And the piece of research, and I will try to find the reference, but I can't find it right now, is that that almost 75% of what staff learn in staff development, they never use, which is horrifying for any of us who do a ton of staff development. And there were essentially 3 or 4 reasons why staff didn't use what they learned in staff development. One is they didn't have supervisor support. So we often send line workers to training, but the CEO, the authorizing authority in an organization is not involved, right? So when I work with an organization, I'm making sure the leadership's in the room, right, to counter that. The second reason that people don't use what they've learned is they learn something new that they actually want to practice, but they go back to systems that have not changed. So how am I supposed to implement this thing I learned about diversity and hiring when our hiring system, I have to follow the rules in the hiring system? How am I supposed to do this new thing I learned when the system over here hasn't changed? The third reason that we don't implement what we learn in training is that if we don't do something with it, like do something with it within 6 to 8 weeks of when we learned it, we never do. So I don't know if you're anything like me. I go to these workshops. It's like, wow, that was great. I got the handout packet. It's on my desk. I'm going to put it here to read later. And then it goes to the pile on my desk.
Yep.
And then it goes from the pile on my desk to the filing cabinet, right? So I don't use it right away. I never do. And so in addition to training, all of the work I do now has 2 additional components to it. I also do assessment. So assessment, training, and then everything I do now has action learning. So how do we take what you learned in whatever training session we do and apply it to deconstructing some policy, practice, organizational culture thing to see where white dominant culture or the assumptions we're making about diversity, inclusion, equity are embedded in what we typically do around here. So how do we first deconstruct this to develop the skill of seeing our assumptions? And then how do we reconstruct the policy, practice, whatever it is, with equity, with our values about diversity, inclusion, equity at the center of it? So that's an application piece following training. And then the other piece is coaching, particularly coaching of leaders. So how are you going to lead these efforts? How are you going to show up embodying the values we talked about? How are you going to be able to take risks and actually supervise for this competency that we're trying to train?
And I think this is one of the reasons we use some different terminology of why there's such a connection between what you do and what we do, both on a DE&I perspective as well as organizational alignment. When you talked about you do the training for the first, second level, but the leaders aren't there, we constantly work with organizations on alignment that you have to have 3 different levels, buckets of types of communication and alignment work. And that's an organization wide. What does it mean to live by your mission? What are the core tenets of it with DE&I? What does that actually mean? How are you telling stories from an organization or team perspective? Then there's cross team as you work collaboratively with that common language to say, hey, we're mission driven, we're equity driven. How do we do that? And then that individual. So you're absolutely right. If you don't have leadership connected in that same frequency and then willing to practice and build muscle memory on what this looks, to remove the barriers, the word that kind of came into my mind that's not exactly apropos is bureaucracy. There's a cultural bureaucracy that's there that hinders this free flow of the shared ideas as well as the disparate ideas that can actually make some great things happen. And to with coaches to be able to help ask the right questions and catalyze and say, boy, yes, that HR system, even though we want to hire differently, that HR system that asks for this specific criteria and runs everything through the computer to find out those individuals that have the MBA and 8 years of experience in this and done that, and it's an automated process, actually goes and kind of actively keeps the opportunities away for people of color, for BIPOC. It's really interesting. And to bring that out and start practicing it and making some mistakes initially and starting to say, okay, my muscles are tired, but this is good stuff, because I'm lifting, excuse me, I'm lifting with things that I've never used before. So it's really interesting that they have that, but this also ties into what we talked about previously about these DE&I initiatives being separate from the core mission and processes and policies and procedures, because you have to have that to be able to actually move the organization forward in a fundamental and stable ways. Correct?
Yes, and what you said, Eric, it makes me want to back up a minute, because I want to define some terms. I think
I was looking to go there right next. Yep. Good.
All right. Well, let's do that. Because I think one of the things that prevents some initiatives from being successful is people are not clear what they're talking about. And it's really hard to do organizational culture change if we're not clear what we're talking about, right? So let me just propose some definitions. we often think about diversity as the differences that we have, right? And we have so many differences, whether it's about race or gender or whatever, but we also know some differences make more difference than others. And so follow this tongue twister. The difference that make a difference depends on context, right? So depending on the context we're in, the differences make a difference. And so one of the questions, and this is not just a definitional question, it's a planning question. So as we're thinking about diversity, right, which I just want to define, as often we define diversity as numerical representation. And we have thought in the field that if we have numerical representation, we can count the people, we will have different outcomes. And we actually know that's not true, because we can have numerical representation. We can have people around the table, but if the organizational culture hasn't changed, we don't have inclusion. So we can think of diversity as count the people and inclusion as the people count. What are the policies? What are the practices? What is the organizational culture where the different ideas, different people around the table, we have an organizational culture that their points of view, their experience is actually going to surface in a way that really contributes to the innovation and engagement of our organization. So just having the people around the table doesn't mean they're going to feel included. So if you think about diversity is count the people, inclusion the people count. The reason I said...
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
There's one thing that is in there. It almost seems like by counting the people, and you have certain percentages or whatever, it almost seems like organizations are feeling that through osmosis and this passive, just being connected in front of one another, that all of a sudden or through some course of time, without active participation in removing of barriers and things like we've talked about, it's going to naturally bring a more inclusive environment, but that's not necessarily
not at all, because one of the things that we know from this intercultural development process, we know is that being in the vicinity of difference, meaning I've got numerical representation. And I want to be clear, numerical representation is necessary. It's just not sufficient. Right. So I'm not saying don't have numerical diversity. It's just not enough. Because one of the things we know is I can be in the vicinity of difference and not have the skills, the ability to experience that difference. Or I might experience my experience through the lens I bring to my experience. In other words, Eric, you and I—
If you're even interested, yeah. Right, yeah.
Well, right, but you and I could have the same experience as our entire life. We can be in the same vicinity of difference, and you lean in with curiosity and interest, and I lean in with fear and anxiety and never want to have it again. It's not our experience, it's how we experience our experience and what we're open to and what we're willing to do. So a lot of organizations like, yes, we want numerical diversity, good first step. But first of all, the planning question is, what are the differences that make a difference in your work, right? Like, what are the differences that make a difference? And that depends on context. If you're working in a health system and you know that there's huge disparities among BIPOC folks of color around COVID, which we'll get to more in a minute, but the huge disparities, and you don't have anybody on staff who really understands the social determinants of health and what's going on for those populations, your planning question is, what are the differences that make a difference given the challenges we're facing, right? That's like who we need to think about hiring in order to meet our organizational challenges. And then the question is, how do we make sure we're getting input? What are the structures? What is the process we have to make sure these folks feel included? So if diversity is count the people, and inclusion is the people count, equity is the outcomes count. What are we after? Why are we doing this? How is this connected to our mission? And most often, equity is about narrowing the disparities. So when we talk about the disproportionate impact of COVID on BIPOC communities, equity is, what are the outcomes we're after in terms of, let's say, managing the pandemic for BIPOC folks? Because the other key definition, and then I'll stop rambling about definitions, the other key definition that I work with my clients on is this notion of universal design. And universal design, Eric, essentially is from the disability rights movement. And it's the concept that if we figure out what are the differences that make a difference, what are the outcomes we want for those who are currently most marginalized, right? We figure out who currently has least access, who's currently most marginalized, and we design our systems for them. We actually then design something better for everybody. So the classic example is the curb cut in the sidewalk, right? It was designed for folks who had least access, folks in wheelchairs. But everybody uses the curb cut in the sidewalk, right? And so part of what happens in organizations sometimes, it's like, well, 80% of our customers are just fine the way things are. Why do we have to design for them, right? And if we care about the 20% at all, we're going to do these one-off initiatives for them, which are hardly ever separate but equal. So the idea of universal design kind of shifts the 80-20 thing. What if we think about the 20% who have least access, design something better for them, and then test how it works for everybody else? My experience is you actually design something better for everybody. So that was a long thing about definitions.
Right, absolutely. And that design theory is really interesting because it runs counter. You mentioned the 80-20 rule. It runs counter to everything that we've really kind of been taught, that, you know, from a capitalistic type of framework, that, you know, it would just be, it costs too much and take too much effort to be able to go and serve that last 20%. You said, you know, you could do these other initiatives, and by and of themselves, they are not separate but equal, but they also require so much incongruity with kind of the core of it. It's hard to maintain, and everything like that. So when we first got together and you talked about this design theory concept, it scratched my itch in the aspect that if you're going to do something right, like, look at what you really need to get done and set up the structures and processes and the efforts to be able to go and get it done. So this concept of bringing, you're counting the people count, and then the outcomes count, ties directly to the mission of what an organization wants to do, that if they really want to fulfill that mission, to be able to go and design a culture in organization that has that diversity, has that inclusion, and then equity, brings out the business outcomes that they're actually really looking for, and brings them to that last 5% or so that really make organizations unique. Because most organizations have 95% of them that have the same stuff: business processes, people, whatever. And it's that extra 5% that really makes, you know, individuals and organizations truly successful and transformational.
Well, and I think it's really a shift in consciousness. So rather than thinking about, oh, it's going to be really expensive to reach that last 20%, it's really about, if we hold equity at the center, and that 20% that we're willing to not serve or not serve well, if we put them at the center, can we actually experiment? Can we actually see? Can we actually try to see if we actually create a system that works for everybody? Will it work for everybody? Because right now we're willing to have a system not work for everybody because we think it will work for the majority. So this is not, we're going to serve the last 20%. It's actually, we're going to serve everybody. We're just going to do it by doing it differently.
And our conversation has been somewhat internally focused on how you get an organization to be more equitable, but this is really outward as well. How do you look to create a structure in an organization that actually can go and meet the needs of 100% of the stakeholders that are out there?
I'm trying to think of a good example to share with you. So, and maybe because I used a healthcare example, I'll use another healthcare example and think about this externally. So I was working with a hospital system that was designing new child and maternal, it was designing a facility around child and maternal health. And they wanted to put equity at the center as they were designing everything, the architecture, the nursing systems, you know, all of it. And one of the things that they found, because they were thinking about, okay, X% of our moms that are going to come in are going to be PIBOC folks, and X% of them are not going to have insurance, and X% of them are not going to speak English. So how do we hold those people at the planning? So as they did this, they started designing what is the welcome system as somebody comes to the nurse's statement. What is the signage? How are they going to have snacks for the families who are waiting because maybe they don't have food at home? Like, how are they actually going to design it? And what they realized was that they were making a much more family-friendly environment for everyone. That was the difference, and that they were hoping, it just, recently opened, I think they're still gathering some research, but that they were hoping that the birth experience would be so much less stressful for the moms and the kids and the families that they were going to impact the health of the first year of the infant and the postpartum experience of the moms and the prenatal experience. Like, were the moms going to be more able to come to the hospital to get prenatal care because they actually felt included and they actually saw that these folks really had their best interests at heart? And what were the outcomes going to be in terms of birth weight and maternal health and postpartum depression and all of those things that you can actually measure in terms of outcome? So, I think as you think about this as an organizational development alignment, they're not just going to measure this for the BIPOC moms, they're going to measure it for everybody. And my hunch is, they're still doing research, my hunch is they're going to see improvements for everybody. That's the difference.
Absolutely. So I would imagine this will get into kind of the next aspect of when you work with organizations like the one in this healthcare example, how many, or I don't know if I'm going to be asking this question properly, so forgive me. But when you work with organizations, I would imagine a good number of them, even if they want to hold the mission and equity at the center, have not actually practiced that. And there's a process to be able to do some change management before you really kind of get into the organizational development. If you could, for our listeners, explain what you see in the marketplace with your clients on being able to go and bring equity more towards the center and connect it with the mission and vision and that transformation that can happen, and then the impact on results.
So I think you asked me previously what kind of organizations I work with, and I mostly work with nonprofit, social sector, or foundations, philanthropy. And I don't work a whole lot with corporate, I have to say. And part of it is because my experience is that the corporate folks are not as open to how long this process takes.
Right, sure.
Right? So my typical process is 18 months to 3 years. This is not quick, right? And so I typically start with assessment using focus groups, key contact interviews, but also this instrument called the IDI, the Intercultural Development Intercultural Development Inventory, which we can talk more about later. I use the data from that instrument, which is a reliable, validated psychometric tool, along with focus groups and key contact interviews to determine, what's going on in the organization and in terms of the mission, vision, strategy. I'll review all the documents. I'll look at every organizational report and strategic plan, do it all. And then we'll probably have a series of learning sessions. But I actually try to start my action learning, the organizational development thing, after 2 or 3 learning sessions. And these learning sessions are not an hour long. They're half day or full day sessions.
Learning sessions being the kind of development of the common nomenclature and frequency of communication. Right. Is that what you're talking about? Okay.
Yeah. Learning sessions are about, can we develop shared meaning? Do we have a shared theory of change here? Do we have some skills to talk to each other? Do we have some conflict, particularly conflict skills? Because as soon as you start talking about this, people start having feelings. So do we have some skills to manage conflict with each other? Do we have some ideas of our own identity and how we manage power, right? So there's some stuff that we want people grounded in. And then, I often introduce folks to the action learning methodology. And in the assessment phase, we'll figure out, along with leadership, some potential low-hanging fruit to start the action learning process with, and then we'll get more and more in depth, right? Because we want people to learn the methodology and have some early wins around action learning. And along with that, I'll often be either forming, if it's not existed before, or working with the organization's DEI task force. And some of that is, they're the eyes and ears on the ground that are two-way communication around how the process is going. But as the process continues, it's over time less and less consultant focused and more building internal capacity. So how to build the capacity of folks in the DEI task force, do some capacity building workshops with them. So in the future, they can lead some of the action learning work. Or if there's already an action learning staff within the organization, how to skill them up to do action learning, particularly around DEI work, right? So, so it takes a while. And my experience is corporate clients are not always willing to do that.
Well, that's I'd love to be able to make sure to clarify this. It seems like one of the key differences, if not the key difference, is that, say, a nonprofit or a foundation has somewhat of a different mindset, that they may be more open to it. There's a different reason for existing, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're inherently more diverse or inclusive in the beginning.
No, they just see a more direct link to their mission, and frankly have more dissonance between their own way they are currently operating and what their aspiration is.
Right.
And, as an educator, as a change agent, dissonance and discomfort are our best friends. If people are not uncomfortable with the way things are, they're less likely to change.
Right.
So part of my role as a consultant is helping people live into dissonance, live into discomfort, and challenge them around their level of comfort. And I'll say more about comfort in a second, and support them through the dissonance to get to a place of change that they really want. One of the things, the reason I want to, what was that? Sorry.
I'm a youth basketball coach, and I use some of the same concepts with the kids that I coach. And I talk to them about pushing to failure, pushing to discomfort, because that's the only way you're going to find out, one, where the edge of your capabilities are, and work on how to be able to go and work past them and have me coach that you have this capability. Let's keep working on it. You're going to grow. There's going to be new stuff happening. So without that, edge of mistake and uncomfortability, dissonance, you're really not going to be going near as fast or as far as you could if you didn't.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I completely agree with you. And I want to add in another piece. I mean, I'm right there with you. I want to just add another piece. And I guess I want to say this to your listeners who might also be white-bodied as I am. When I think about it, I get to walk through the world most of the times as a white person with relative comfort. The world sort of reflects back that it's made for me. I don't have to think about my race. I don't often have to think about being the only one in a room and what that might be like, right? I'm pretty comfortable. In other parts of my identity, I'm somebody who's Jewish, a lesbian, a New Yorker in Minnesota. That's a thing.
A New Yorker in Minnesota, right? Okay.
Yeah. I'm not always completely comfortable. So I bring that up, less about me, but more to suggest that comfort's really a privilege. So if I'm completely comfortable in any setting, it probably means that environment is made for me, right? So one of the things that I think it's important to think about is how, as folks who care about diversity, inclusion, equity, assuming your listeners have gotten to this point in the podcast, because they do, how do I use my own sense of comfort as a signal to ask the question? If I'm completely comfortable here, who's likely uncomfortable? Because somebody's always holding the discomfort for the group. Somebody's always uncomfortable. If I'm completely comfortable, that means this environment's made for me. Who might be uncomfortable? right? And how do we use our sense of comfort as a question to start being more empathetic about who might not be as included as I am in the moment? The other thing I just want to say is that for those of us who are white-bodied and are sort of used to being comfortable, and this is just my experience, we often equate discomfort with lack of safety. If I'm uncomfortable, it means I'm unsafe. No, it just means you're uncomfortable. That's all it means, is you're uncomfortable. And the sense of discomfort can be a gift that you give your organization, your community, to say, oh, I'm uncomfortable. What's the learning that's emerging here? How can I be more aware about what I'm uncomfortable with and what somebody else might be living with every single day?
And that's a leadership imperative to be able to go, like I mentioned with me coaching, I constantly push to failure, that making mistakes is a good thing. Being uncomfortable is a good thing because it is opening up to possibilities and growth. So as you mentioned, as a white male, I have more areas where I'm comfortable than you in our society. But yeah, if I'm more comfortable in the conversations there and people are not feeling open enough to be able to be their true selves or express an opinion or an insight that runs somewhat counter to the conversation that's kind of coming, leaders have to be able to make sure that those types of conversations, that dissonance, the uncomfortability, the quest for the ultimate, kind of not ultimate truth, but, the useful and 100%, available for everyone, the equitable truth that's there. And that's a real leadership challenge, not only for the top leaders, but how do you actually build the capacity of the leaders at different levels to be able to go and embrace that as a real strength, that once you sit there and say, okay, I'm uncomfortable. Why am I uncomfortable? Here are the possibilities. Tim, Shaniqua, Beth, whatever it is, what is it, you're uncomfortable? I could sense maybe in a situation you might be uncomfortable. Why are you uncomfortable? What is it about the design of our products or services or the way we go about it is different in your mind? And how do we make that happen together?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you, Eric. I think that's part of it. And just to add to that, it's also what we hear when we open up to hear each other. So I'll give you an example. I was in a conversation this morning with a woman who's African American. And one of the things we were talking about is sometimes how she's perceived as the angry Black woman. And so we were talking about this. And she gave me an example in which she said, she was, and how much she winds up censoring herself so that she's not experienced that way. She gave me an example of how she was in a DEI workshop or something. And the facilitator asked her a question, and she said, it's really hard for me, I'm paraphrasing, it's really hard for me to feel like I belong and fit here among all of my colleagues who are mostly white, upper class.
Right.
Right? And she got a ton of blowback about the white upper class thing, right? And what they didn't hear, and she was asked to apologize and, et cetera. And what folks, her colleagues focused on was, don't label me, you're stereotyping me, whatever. They took offense, they got defensive. What they did not hear and didn't open themselves up to was the first part of her sentence. It's hard for me to feel like I belong here. Like, what would it really mean to really listen with open heart? It's like, that was a gift she just gave. She was super vulnerable. It's hard for me to feel like I belong here. Right? And so that's part of that too.
And, I see this once again with basketball or anyone that comes to a superior, there's a trust versus power relationship that's all there in any type of dynamic relationship. When someone comes to the superior and say, I feel this. Things are not right. And when they get slapped down, like you just imagine saying, you shouldn't think this way. You don't deserve to think this way. Look at how well you have it. Wow, that it doesn't matter if you're BIPOC or whatever, you're letting something out that you're uncomfortable, and you're taking it, putting your neck out, sticking your neck out to say, this is the way I feel. They have an organization's not there. But now just imagine if they do, whether it's the cultural and the way things are communicated, or I feel that our products and services are not meeting the needs of our entire stakeholder base. That could be the community. It could be, a certain segment or two of the population. If you have that open heart, just imagine what you could do with your products and services and the markets that you'd be able to go and get at, whether it's a nonprofit, whether it is a for-profit, whether it's education, whether it's government. It honestly doesn't matter. The additive nature of actually being able to open up yourself. We're running on our time here, Beth. So I was wondering if we could kind of close things off. If there were, regardless of whether they're profit, nonprofit, what are some of the things that leaders, HR on the business side, executive directors on nonprofits, school superintendents, when they're looking at the opportunities and issues around diversity, inclusion, and equity, what is it that they really should be addressing in their own minds, looking at, to be able to try and get somewhat of a view to be what's really going on?
I think the first thing is just to circle back to where you started, Eric, is to really look first at the organization's mission, vision, and values, and figure out why. Why are you doing this? Why is this really important to you? And if you can't come up with a why, a core purpose that is linked to your outcomes, you might not want to engage yet. Because doing this work is a commitment of resources. And I'm not just talking about consultant resources. I'm talking about time, energy, goodwill, all of those resources that are precious in an organization. So first, figure out the why. What is the core purpose you're trying to achieve? What are the outcomes? You might not know exactly all the outcomes, but start with something. What are we really hoping is going to be different? And once you can figure that out, then you can start saying, okay, what are all the potential processes that we might need in order to actually achieve our core purpose? And like I said earlier, the core purpose, really, the more it is linked to your core mission, vision, strategy, and then linking it to organizational development and change management work, the more likely you're actually going to have any kind of outcome that is really going to suit you moving towards your core mission. So I think that's a place to start, is really about a why. And then once you can figure out the why and can figure out, okay, we really want this to be different, then you can go around figuring out what your process is. Do you want to hire a consultant? Do you have internal resources to help you do this? The thing I would just say is wanting change is really good. And we can't make change without making change. So here's another one of those like sayings. You know how we always say, doing what we've always done gets us what we've always got? Right? In a world that is in this much turmoil right now, right? With this much change happening on a daily basis, doing what we've always done, I want to suggest to you, is going to get you less than you always got. Because the demographics are changing, the needs of our community are changing, the conversation about race equity is more focused and more deliberate, and people's expectations are higher for good reason. So doing what we've done actually gets us less than we've always got.
There's two things there's two items to that. You mentioned first is to have a leader understand the why, what's the reason, how does it connect with mission and vision? That individual, or even
I don't mean just the leader. I mean,
right.
Everybody needs to understand that.
Yeah, but it's probably going to start within that leadership team.
Sure.
I would strongly venture that they need to have conversations with someone that is going to catalyze some different thought, because if there are issues around diversity, inclusion, and equity, they're probably not exactly all that diverse and have the capacities to think a little bit differently on there. To have someone maybe like you, even on that front aspect of really helping them ask the right questions, because they may not know what they don't know and what questions
Mm-hmm.
that they really should ask. So as they go through the process, to believe that they can figure it out within that same group, you're structured exactly to get the results that you get, which is another way of saying the same
Right.
thing that you
Exactly.
mentioned.
Yeah. No, I
You're going to
agree.
get a result that's going to be based on what you have there. So bringing that out is really necessary. And then this aspect that you kind of mentioned in the end about, all the processes and what the possibilities are, they tie into these pillars of alignment that we talked about all the time, that it is really hard to become aligned as an organization if you're not looking at how you can best serve. Are you really missing out on parts of fulfilling your mission because you are not having the type of
Mm-hmm.
diversity, inclusion, equity that is possible? And what could be the delta on that from a strict business perspective or outcome perspective on a nonprofit or education, of what it would mean to kids to actually have, an environment that helps, you know, BIPOC, anyone that's coming through the school system, to be able to go and make sure that they feel wanted and included and can express their heart and, what's possible on a societal level. And we talked about this when we did our prep call, and I'll close this out. We really believe that the work environment is a interesting and valuable way to be able to go and help affect the societal change that you mentioned in these times. Then the workplace, where we can have this microcosm, this laboratory to help people understand folks with one another, that it could end up carrying over. Because you mentioned the tough times that we're going through. It is through these tough times, all these different mutations and nuances that come out actually bring the innovation. So yeah, if you're standing still, you're going to be left behind. And these are opportunities to really address where the possibilities are. And I hope that what is going on now is a catalyst that people are not going to be accepting of the systemic and institutional ways that it's all been done before. And people will get pushed along, but the ones that really go at it with diligence and open-heartedness and honesty will be the ones that will really reap a lot more benefits than the ones that are going to drag their feet or hold themselves back from any of it.
It's been a pleasure to be with you and to have this conversation. So my hope is that this was helpful to you, interesting for your listeners, and yeah, I hope you let me know how it goes.
I absolutely will. And for those listeners that are interested in learning more and ask those questions of themselves, Beth is a marvelous individual to be able to go and either talk with you herself, or has a wonderful network of people that will be able to go and help ask some of those critical questions that you might know, and then see if there's a path to be able to go and improve how you can drive organizational alignment through greater levels of diversity, inclusion, and equity. So Beth, thank you so much for all the insights that you brought to me, to our listeners. I've really enjoyed our time together.
Yeah, I did as well, Eric. And if people do want to find out more, my website is just my name, BethZemsky.com. So,
sounds really good. And I'll make sure that gets posted up on all the material that we have coming through. So thank you so much for your time. Have yourself a great rest of the day, and I'll look forward to talking with you soon.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Beth Zemsky. She has some marvelous, unique ideas on how you can look at fulfilling your mission and vision more impactfully by bringing diversity, equity, and inclusion into the core of what you do. The business implications, whether your education, for-profit, not-for-profit, law enforcement, government, are significant. If you take the pillars of alignment, most specifically teamwork, creativity, communication, the best practices of having a more diverse and inclusive and equitable workforce, and that diversity of thought, to be able to bring those nuances and mutations that we've talked about in previous episodes to the fore that other organizations don't, can take you to the next level. Beth brought out some really interesting concepts on the design theory to be able to go and design something that serves all. How leaders can not only help set a common nomenclature and frequency around diversity, equity, and inclusion and how it connects to mission and vision, but set forth the wheels to be able to go and practice those concepts and remove bureaucratic barriers to be able to go and help facilitate that process as well, and then just keep building upon it and building upon it. It's a practice that can be strengthened and honed and enhanced as you get better and better. As Beth mentioned, she does a lot of work in the nonprofit and foundation space, but as I hope you saw, or hope you heard in that conversation, it doesn't matter what type of organization you are. To be able to bring a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive environment internally with the focus externally of how you're going to be able to go and deliver on your mission and vision to your stakeholders will only have positive repercussions. BethZemsky.com, Z as in Zeta, EMSKY.com, to be able to get a hold of her, or you can get a hold of me and I'm happy to be able to go and connect you. Thanks again for taking the time to be able to listen. We have some Super Bowl related episodes coming up since we're coming up on that. So listen to those, some really interesting ways of looking at teamwork as well as messaging and how it relates to achieving mission and vision coming up. Keep sending those comments in. I love to hear from you. I really appreciate it. Have yourself a great day, everybody. Cheers.